Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a side of ancient Rome that the marble statues and history textbooks tend to ignore. Because while Rome liked to advertise itself as the center of civilization, a large part of the population lived in places that were less imperial and more try not to get stabbed on the way home. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining from around the world. When most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture something very elegant. Marble temples glowing in the sunlight, senators walking around in crisp white togas, looking thoughtful and important, triumphal arches, statues of heroic generals, and fountains gently splashing in picturesque plazas. In other words, the Rome you would see on the brochure. And yes, that Rome absolutely existed, but it was not where most Romans lived. Those beautiful monuments were basically the city's public relations department. If ambassadors, traders, or visiting dignitaries arrived in Rome, this was the version they were shown. Look at our temples, look at our roads, look at how civilized we are. What they did not immediately show visitors were the neighborhoods a few streets away, because the real Rome was loud, crowded, chaotic, and occasionally smelled like something had died and nobody wanted to deal with it. By the 1st century, Rome may have had around 1 million residents. That made it the largest city in the ancient world. Unfortunately, it was also a city that had never heard of zoning laws, building inspectors, or the radical idea that streets should be wide enough for 2 carts to pass without starting a diplomatic incident. Space was limited, which meant buildings went up, very far up. Most Romans lived in apartment blocks called insulae. These were tall, narrow buildings, stacked several stories high and squeezed into tight streets like architectural Tetris. The lower floors were more desirable and therefore more expensive. The higher you went, the cheaper the rent became. Also, the closer you were to meeting gravity in a very personal way if the building collapsed, because the construction quality of many insulae could be described as ambitious. Landlords liked to build quickly and cheaply. Wooden beams, thin walls, and questionable foundations were common. Fires happened often, collapses happened occasionally, which made the phrase top-floor apartment slightly more dramatic than intended. Meanwhile, the streets below were constantly busy. Street vendors shouted their prices, carts rattled loudly over stone roads, donkeys wandered wherever they pleased. Neighbors argued through walls that were roughly the thickness of a Roman sandwich. And because Rome did not have modern garbage collection, residents sometimes solved the problem by throwing waste out the window, which meant walking down a Roman street required awareness, agility, and perhaps a mild sense of fatalism. Ancient writers like Juvenal complained about this constantly, not just the crowds, but the noise, the smells, and the occasional airborne surprises. So while Rome loved to present itself as the capital of civilization, most of its citizens experienced a very different version. A city of leaning buildings, crowded alleys, and neighborhoods where daily life was less about philosophy and more about not getting robbed or hit by someone's leftover dinner. Now that we have established that Rome was crowded, noisy, and occasionally hazardous to your dignity, we need to talk about where most people actually lived. The answer was the insulae. These were Rome's apartment buildings, and they were everywhere. Entire neighborhoods were filled with them, rising several stories high and packed tightly along narrow streets. If you imagine something like a modern apartment block, you're already being too generous.
Insulae were usually built quickly, cheaply, and with the architectural philosophy of, we will worry about the consequences later. They were essentially Roman skyscrapers for the working class. A typical insula might have 4, 5, or even 6 stories. In earlier periods, some reached ridiculous heights before Roman authorities finally decided that maybe allowing landlords to build towers made mostly of wood was not the greatest long-term strategy. Emperor Augustus eventually set limits on how tall they could be. Later emperors had to repeat this rule, which tells you how seriously landlords took safety regulations, which is to say, not very. The ground floor was the most desirable. Shops and businesses operated there, and wealthier tenants could rent the lower apartments. These units were larger, sturdier, and had easier access to the street. The higher you climbed, the worse things became. Upper floors were cramped, poorly ventilated, and often built with lighter materials. Residents had to carry water upstairs by hand because plumbing rarely reached that high. Imagine hauling buckets of water up 5 flights of stairs every day just so you could cook dinner. Rome's version of a gym membership. The risk of collapse was always present. Ancient writers describe buildings that suddenly gave way because the structure was weak, or the landlord had decided to add another floor without asking the laws of physics for permission. Fires were also common. Oil lamps, wooden beams, crowded living spaces, and cooking fires made the insula perfect environments for disasters. Once a fire started, it spread quickly. And if you lived on the top floor, escape could be difficult. Yet, despite all these problems, people continued to rent these apartments, because if you worked in Rome, you needed to live close to where the work was, and that meant accepting a home that might lean slightly to one side and occasionally make unsettling noises at night. In other words, Roman housing was affordable, but the term stable living environment was negotiable. If ancient Rome had a neighborhood that every parent warned their children about, it was the Suburra. The Suburra was located just northeast of the Roman Forum, squeezed between several hills, including the Ascaline and the Vimuli. That meant it sat right next to the political and ceremonial heart of the empire, which is a little ironic because only a few hundred meters away from the Senate, triumphal arches, and magnificent temples was one of the most chaotic and notorious districts in the city. The Suburra was loud, it was crowded, and it had a reputation. The streets were narrow and packed with activity at all hours. Shops lined the ground floors of Insula. Bakers, blacksmiths, cobblers, barbers, and merchants competed loudly for customers. Above them towered apartment buildings filled with tenants who were also making noise, arguing with neighbors, cooking meals, and occasionally dropping things out the window, sometimes accidentally, sometimes not. If you walked through the Suburra during the day, it felt like the entire city had gathered in one place. Vendors shouted prices, carts rattled over stone streets, children ran between buildings, and somewhere nearby someone was always arguing about money. But as busy as the Suburra was during daylight, it became even more unpredictable after dark. Taverns filled with gamblers and soldiers, brothels opened their doors to late-night customers, and the darker corners of the district became comfortable workplaces for pickpockets and other professionals in the field of taking things that did not belong to them. Roman writers often complained about the Suburra, describing it as noisy, dangerous, and morally questionable, which of course made it one of the most liveliest areas in the city. Interestingly, the Suburra was not exclusively poor. People from many different social classes passed through it because it sat along important routes between the Forum and other parts of Rome. Even Julius Caesar spent his early years there. Yes, the future dictator of Rome grew up in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, which probably explains why he later seemed very comfortable navigating chaotic political situations. After surviving the Suburra, the Roman Senate probably felt relaxing by comparison. The district had energy, opportunity, and constant movement. But it also had something else: trouble. And if you were new to Rome, someone would eventually give you a simple piece of advice. If you must pass through the Suburra, do it during the day and keep walking. During the day, Rome was chaotic. At night, it became something else entirely. Because once the sun went down, the city changed personality. Shops closed, respectable citizens returned home, and the streets slowly emptied. What remained was a much smaller group of people. Some of them were drunk, some of them were criminals, and some of them were both. One of the biggest problems was lighting. Ancient Rome did not have streetlights in the modern sense. Most streets were dark, especially in poorer neighborhoods where nobody was particularly eager to spend money on public illumination. So after sunset, walking through the city meant navigating narrow alleys and uneven roads with very little visibility, which criminals appreciated enormously. Roman writers frequently warned about the dangers of being out late. The poet Juvenal complained that walking through Rome at night required courage and a willingness to accept certain risks. Robbers could hide in doorways or alley corners and jump unsuspecting pedestrians.
Street gangs sometimes roamed the darker districts, and drunken arguments could quickly turn into full-scale fights. If someone knocked you unconscious in a dark street, there was a good chance nobody would notice until morning. Even the hazards that were not criminal could still be unpleasant. For example, Roman apartment buildings often had a creative solution for garbage disposal. They threw it out the window. Food scraps, broken pottery, waste from cooking, and occasionally chamber pots were simply dumped into the street below, which meant walking at night involved an additional risk. Not only could you be robbed, but something unpleasant might fall from above without warning. Juvenal once joked that if you planned to walk through Rome after dark, you should write your will before leaving home. This may sound exaggerated, but the concern was real. Even wealthy Romans avoided traveling at night without servants or guards accompanying them. And if someone important absolutely had to move around the city after sunset, They usually traveled with a torchbearer and several companions because the darker streets of Rome were unpredictable places. During the day, the city belonged to merchants, shoppers, and officials. At night, it belonged to everyone else, and everyone else was not always known for polite behavior. If there is one thing every massive city in history has had in abundance, it is opportunity. Opportunity for merchants, opportunity for workers, and opportunity for criminals. Ancient Rome was no exception. With nearly 1 million people moving through crowded markets, festivals, temples, and streets every day, the city provided perfect working conditions for pickpockets and professional thieves. You could say Rome had a thriving service industry, just not the kind anyone requested. Crowds were everywhere. The Forum was packed with merchants and politicians, markets bustled with shoppers. Public games at the Colosseum or Circus Maximus attracted tens of thousands of spectators, and where crowds gather, wallets disappear. Pickpockets were skilled at blending into the chaos. A quick bump, a distraction, a sudden shout from an accomplice, and suddenly your purse or coin pouch was no longer yours. By the time you realized what had happened, the thief was already 3 streets away. Roman writers regularly complained about these criminals. Martial joked about thieves who could steal so smoothly that the victim only noticed hours later, which is impressive in a technical sense. Not helpful, but impressive. The problem was that enforcement was limited. Rome's security forces were small compared to the size of the city. Patrols existed, but they could not monitor every crowded street or market stall. That left plenty of room for creative entrepreneurship. Some thieves worked alone, others operated in groups. Gangs developed systems where one person distracted the victim while another removed valuables. A third accomplice might immediately carry the stolen goods away to avoid being caught with evidence. It was teamwork, unethical teamwork, but still impressive coordination. Travelers were particularly vulnerable. Visitors often carried money, did not know the local streets, and could easily become targets, which meant arriving in Rome required some basic survival strategies. Keep valuables hidden, avoid obvious displays of wealth, and if someone suddenly bumped into you in a crowded alley, check your purse immediately. Because while Rome was the center of an empire, it was also the center of a very active underground economy, and the professionals working in that industry were extremely good at their jobs. If the streets of Rome were chaotic during the day and dangerous at night, the taverns made sure the chaos never really stopped. These establishments were called popina, and they were scattered throughout the poorer districts of the city. You could find them in places like the Subura or along busy trade routes, where travelers, laborers, and soldiers needed somewhere to eat, drink, and temporarily forget about their problems. Popina served cheap food and very cheap wine. The food might include bread, olives, lentils, sausages, or stew simmering in large pots. It was simple, filling, and usually eaten quickly while standing or sitting on rough benches. The wine, however, was a different story. Roman tavern wine had a reputation for being flexible. It was often watered down, mixed with herbs, or diluted in creative ways to stretch supplies. Sometimes tavern keepers added flavorings to hide the fact that the wine had been sitting around longer than anyone wanted to admit. If you ordered a drink, you were taking a small gamble. But then again, gambling was part of the entertainment. Inside many taverns, you would find dice games in progress, with patrons betting small amounts of money or goods. Gambling was technically restricted under Roman law, but enforcement was inconsistent, which meant people gambled anyway. The atmosphere inside a popina could change quickly. At one table, merchants might be discussing business. At another, soldiers might be celebrating a recent payday. Nearby, gamblers argued loudly about whose dice were suspiciously lucky. Add alcohol to the situation, and arguments sometimes became fights. Roman writers often described taverns as noisy and morally questionable places. Respectable citizens claimed they avoided them entirely.
This claim was probably optimistic, because despite their reputation, taverns were extremely popular. For many ordinary Romans, they were the closest thing to a social club. People met friends there, exchanged news, and relaxed after long days of work. Of course, relaxing occasionally turned into shouting. Shouting occasionally turned into fighting, and fighting occasionally turned into someone being escorted out the door. But that was simply part of tavern culture. If you walked into a popina expecting peace and quiet, you had misunderstood the purpose of the establishment. Popina were places where Rome's rougher side gathered, and in the bad neighborhoods of the city, they were rarely empty. If there was one pastime Romans loved almost as much as wine, it was gambling. Dice games were everywhere in the poorer districts of the city. In taverns, alleyways, markets, and even outside temples, groups of men gathered around small boards or flat stones, shaking dice and arguing loudly about luck, skill, and whose turn it actually was. Officially, gambling was restricted under Roman law. Unofficially, almost everyone ignored that rule, unless a particularly strict official happened to be nearby. The game itself was simple. Players rolled dice and bet coins, small goods, or occasionally anything they happened to have on them. A few lucky rolls could turn a small wager into a decent amount of money. Unfortunately, luck was not always the main factor involved. Rome's gambling scene attracted a certain kind of professional, the hustler. These individuals had mastered the art of making a game appear fair while quietly tilting the odds in their favor. Some used weighted dice. Others relied on distraction, fast hands, or accomplices who pretended to be fellow players. If a newcomer arrived in a neighborhood tavern looking curious and slightly wealthy, the hustlers would quickly welcome them to the game very warmly. For the first few rounds, the new player might even win. This helped build confidence and encouraged larger bets. Then, the luck changed. Suddenly, the dice behaved strangely. The newcomer lost one wager, then another, and another. By the time the player realized something was wrong, most of their money had quietly migrated across the table. And if they protested too loudly, the surrounding players might remind them that tavern disputes were not always resolved peacefully. Street hustlers also worked outside taverns. Some ran small betting games in busy markets where crowds gathered. Others operate shell games or quick wages designed to separate impatient travelers from their coins. The trick was always the same: move quickly, confuse the victim, disappear before anyone had time to think. Roman writers frequently mocked these gamblers and tricksters, but they were a normal part of city life, because where crowds, money, and alcohol meet, someone is always ready to offer a friendly game. And in the bad neighborhoods of Rome, those games rarely ended with everyone smiling. Crime made Rome dangerous. Fire made it terrifying. Because while thieves might steal your money, a fire could take everything you owned in a single night. Ancient Rome was extremely vulnerable to fires. The city was packed tightly with insula apartment buildings, many of which were built with wooden beams and flimsy materials. Kitchens used open flames for cooking, and oil lamps burned constantly for light. In other words, the entire city was basically one large accident waiting to happen. When a fire started in one building, it could spread quickly to the neighboring structures. The narrow streets and tightly packed rooftops allowed flames to jump from one building to the next like an enthusiastic athlete in a relay race. Once that happened, entire blocks could ignite. The poor neighborhoods were especially vulnerable because the insula were often built quickly and cheaply. Landlords wanted to maximize rent income, which meant squeezing as many tenants as possible in limited space. Fire safety was not high on the priority list. Roman writers described nights when flames suddenly appeared in a distant street, and within minutes the glow spread across the rooftops. Residents woke to shouting, smoke, and the frantic sound of people trying to escape. Imagine living on the 5th floor of a crowded apartment building when that happens. Staircases might already be filled with smoke. Neighbors were rushing downward in panic. Some residents tried climbing across rooftops to escape. Others grabbed whatever possessions they could carry and ran. Many simply fled with nothing. The Roman government eventually created a firefighting force known as the Vigils. These men patrolled the city at night and attempted to control fires when they broke out. Their tools were simple: buckets of water, pumps, hooks used to pull down burning structures, and a lot of shouting. Sometimes they managed to stop a fire before it spread too far. Sometimes they did not. Large fires were common enough that many Romans lived with a quiet understanding that one day their home might vanish in smoke, which meant people in the poorer districts slept each night beside two possibilities: the sound of a thief in the alley or the smell of smoke drifting through the window. By now, you might be wondering whether Rome had any kind of police force. The answer is, sort of. Rome's closest equivalent to nighttime law enforcement was a group called the Vigils. These men served as firefighters, night patrols, and general keepers of order after dark, which sounds like a reasonable job description until you remember that Rome had around 1 million people and a lot of narrow, chaotic streets. The Vigils were divided into several units stationed across the city. They patrolled neighborhoods at night carrying lanterns and basic equipment for fighting fires. Officially, their primary duty was fire prevention. Unofficially, they were also expected to deal with crimes, drunken brawls, suspicious activity, and the occasional citizen loudly insisting that someone had stolen their sandals.
In other words, their responsibilities were broad, their resources were not. Imagine trying to keep order in the largest city of the ancient world with a few patrol groups, minimal lighting, and thousands of people who had spent the evening drinking questionable wine. It was not an easy task. When fires broke out, the vigils were the first responders. They carried buckets, water pumps, axes, and hooks used to tear down burning structures before the flames could spread. If a building caught fire, the strategy sometimes involved demolishing nearby walls to create a barrier. This was effective. It was also extremely unpopular with the owners of those walls. The vigils also acted as night patrols, watching for thieves or suspicious behavior. If they encountered criminals in the act, they could detain them and bring them before Roman authorities. But criminals understood something important. The city was enormous, and the vigils could not be everywhere. In the darker districts, thieves and street gangs often worked in areas where patrols rarely passed. Narrow alleys and crowded neighborhoods provided plenty of hiding places. So while the vigils did provide some protection, they could not eliminate the dangers of the city after dark. For ordinary Romans, the presence of the vigils offered a small sense of reassurance, but not a guarantee.
Because in a city as large and restless as Rome, even a dedicated night watch could only do so much, and sometimes the safest strategy was still the simplest one: stay home after sunset. By this point, ancient Rome might sound like a city where the biggest problems were collapsing apartments, suspicious dice games, and the occasional airborne piece of garbage. But there was another layer to the chaos: street gangs. In the crowded neighborhoods of Rome, groups of young men sometimes formed loose gangs that controlled specific streets or districts. These groups were not always organized in the modern sense, but they could still be dangerous. Some gangs operated as thieves or extortionists. Others simply enjoyed the entertainment value of starting fights. Political figures occasionally used gangs as well. During the late Roman Republic, rival politicians hired groups of rough men to intimidate opponents, disrupt public meetings, or attack rival supporters. In other words, Roman politics sometimes resembled a bar fight with speeches. One famous example involved the political rivals Publius Clodius Pulchar and Titus Annius Milo. Their supporters regularly clashed in the streets, turning parts of Rome into something resembling a battlefield. Riots broke out. Buildings were damaged. At one point, the Roman Senate house itself was burned during the chaos, which is not the kind of incident you expect from a government meeting. But even outside major political conflicts, smaller fights were common in the rougher neighborhoods. Taverns could become the starting point for arguments that spilled out into the streets. Drunken insults, gambling disputes, someone accidentally stepping on the wrong foot. In crowded districts where people lived close together and tempers were short, these arguments sometimes escalated quickly. Weapons were not always necessary. A group of angry men armed with fists, sticks, and enthusiasm could cause plenty of damage. Roman writers often complained about these disturbances, especially at night when street fights could break out unexpectedly. For an ordinary resident, avoiding trouble required awareness. You learned which alleys to avoid, which taverns had reputations for violence, and which groups of men on a street corner were best given a respectful amount of distance. Because while Rome was the capital of a vast empire, parts of the city could still feel like the frontier. And in those neighborhoods, the rule was simple: mind your business or be prepared to run. If you lived in one of Rome's rougher districts, there was one luxury you almost certainly did not have: silence. Ancient Rome was loud during the day, and somehow even louder at night. The crowded neighborhoods were packed with shops, workshops, taverns, carts, animals, and thousands of people all trying to live their lives in very limited space, which meant the soundtrack of the city never really stopped. At sunrise, the markets began waking up. Vendors shouted to attract customers, advertising bread, olives, fish, vegetables, and whatever else they were trying to sell that morning. Blacksmiths hammered metal in workshops, carpenters sawed wood, merchants argued loudly about prices. Carts rolled through the streets carrying goods from the docks or warehouses. The wooden wheels rattled loudly over the stone pavement, creating a constant grinding noise that echoed between the buildings. Donkeys brayed, dogs barked, and somewhere nearby someone was almost certainly arguing with a neighbor. Because when thousands of people live close together, patience becomes a limited resource. Even at night, the noise rarely stopped. Taverns stayed open late, filled with gamblers, musicians, and patrons who believed volume was the best way to win an argument. Drinking songs drifted through the streets. Dice clattered on wooden tables. Occasional fights added their own dramatic sound effects. The poet Martial once joked that Rome was so noisy that even the dead would struggle to sleep there, and he was not entirely exaggerating. Upper floors of apartment buildings were especially miserable for light sleepers.
Thin walls and wooden floors meant you could hear your neighbors talking, arguing, cooking, or moving furniture at all hours. If someone dropped something on the floor above you, the entire apartment might shake. In modern cities, people complain about traffic noise. In ancient Rome, traffic noise was just the beginning. Life in these neighborhoods meant constant movement, constant shouting, and constant activity. Quiet evenings were rare. Peaceful sleep was rarer. But for many Romans, this chaos was simply normal life in the biggest city on earth. If Rome was the heart of the empire, its bad neighborhoods were the heartbeat, loud, fast, and impossible to ignore. If the noise of Rome's bad neighborhoods was unforgettable, the smell was even harder to ignore. Because while the Romans were brilliant engineers who built aqueducts, roads, and enormous monuments, their system for dealing with everyday waste was less impressive. Rome did have sewers. The famous Cloaca Maxima drained parts of the city and carried water away toward the Tiber River. It was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time, but it did not solve every sanitation problem. Far from it. Most apartment buildings did not have indoor plumbing. Many residents used chamber pots inside their homes, especially in the upper floors of insulae. When the pots were full, the contents needed to go somewhere. Ideally, they would be emptied into public latrines or drains. In reality, some residents preferred a faster method, out the window. This practice was so common that Roman law actually addressed it. Regulations warned citizens not to throw dangerous objects or waste into the streets, especially from upper floors. The fact that laws existed tells us something important. People were doing it anyway. Walking down a Roman street meant navigating more than just crowds. You also had to watch your step carefully, because the pavement often contained a mixture of mud, animal droppings, spilled food, and other materials that nobody was eager to identify too closely.
Add summer heat to the equation and the smell could become overwhelming. Markets contributed their own scents. Fish stalls, butcher shops, and food vendors produced piles of organic waste that did not always disappear quickly. Animals wandered through the streets as well. Donkeys pulled carts, horses carried riders, and stray dogs searched for scraps. All of them left something behind. Ancient writers frequently complained about the smell of the city. The poet Martial joked about walking through certain districts and encountering odors so powerful they could almost knock a person unconscious, which may sound exaggerated, but when thousands of people, animals, and businesses share crowded streets without modern sanitation, the results are not subtle. For residents of Rome's poorer neighborhoods, this was simply part of daily life. You got used to it, or at least you tried to, because while the empire proudly displayed its marble monuments to the world, the streets behind those monuments often told a different story, one that involved a lot less marble and a lot more smell. At this point, ancient Rome might sound like a place where collapsing buildings, thieves, fires, noise, and unpleasant smells combined to create what modern real estate listings would generously call a lively neighborhood. So a reasonable question appears. Why did people stay? Why would anyone willingly live in these crowded, dangerous districts when the city clearly had nicer areas? The answer, as usual, was work. Rome was not just a capital city. It was the economic heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Goods from Spain, Egypt, Greece, North Africa, and the Near East flowed constantly through its markets. And those markets needed workers. Dock laborers unloaded ships along the Tiber River. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, pottery, and furniture. Bakers supplied bread to thousands of customers every day. Blacksmiths hammered metal in noisy workshops. Street vendors sold fruit, wine, hot food, and whatever else people might buy while rushing through crowded streets. All of these jobs were located inside the busy districts of the city, which meant workers needed to live nearby. Moving far away might give you cleaner air and quieter nights, but it also meant longer travel times and fewer opportunities to earn money. For people living day to day, that was not a realistic option, so they stayed in the neighborhoods where the action was. Over time, residents learned how to navigate the risks. You discovered which streets were safe and which alleys were better avoided after sunset. You recognized the local tavern owners and knew which places served decent wine and which ones were famous for fights. You kept valuables hidden and avoided displaying wealth in crowded areas. In short, you adapted. These neighborhoods were not just dangerous places. They were also communities. Families lived there for generations. Neighbors knew one another. Shopkeepers recognized regular customers. Life might have been chaotic, but it was familiar, and familiarity creates comfort, even in difficult environments. For many Romans, the crowded districts were not temporary stops on the way to something better. They were home, a noisy, crowded, unpredictable home, but still home. For all their dangers, the rough neighborhoods of Rome were not just places of poverty and crime.
they were also places of opportunity. Because wherever thousands of people gathered together in crowded streets, money begins to move. Markets were everywhere.
Small stalls lined the streets selling bread, olives, fruit, cooked meals, sandals, tools, and countless other goods. A clever merchant could build a steady business in these busy districts simply by placing a table in the right corner and shouting louder than the competition. And shouting was very much part of the job. Street vendors competed fiercely for attention. One might be selling hot sausages, another offered fresh bread. A third loudly claimed that his wine was the finest in the district, which may or may not have been accurate. For a passerby, the street often felt like a living advertisement. But opportunity was not limited to merchants. Craftsmen also worked in these neighborhoods. Blacksmiths forged tools and nails, carpenters built furniture and carts, potters shaped clay vessels used in kitchens across the city. Many workshops were located on the ground floors of Insuli, with workers living just upstairs, which meant your commute was extremely short, possibly just one staircase. The same crowds that attracted thieves also attracted customers. A busy street guaranteed a steady flow of people who might buy food, tools, clothing, or services. In this sense, the bad neighborhoods were the economic engine of Rome. They were messy, loud, and chaotic, but they were full of life. Ambitious individuals could rise through these environments. A successful merchant might eventually open a larger shop. A skilled craftsman could build a reputation that attracted wealthier clients. Even some wealthy Romans began their lives in humble districts before climbing the social ladder. The city offered possibilities. You just had to survive long enough to take advantage of them. And that survival required a mix of hard work, caution, and a healthy awareness of your surroundings. Because in Rome's busiest neighborhoods, opportunity and danger often shared the same street, sometimes the same building, and occasionally the same tavern table, which made life exciting but rarely predictable. When Roman emperors wanted to show the greatness of their empire, they did not take visitors into the Suburra at midnight. They showed them the Forum. They showed them temples covered in marble, triumphal arches celebrating victories, and enormous public buildings designed to impress anyone who happened to be watching. This was the Rome of speeches, ceremonies, and statues. It was magnificent, but it was not the whole story. The real Rome, the one where most people lived, was something very different. It was the Rome of crowded apartment blocks, where neighbors could hear each other through thin walls. The Rome of narrow streets filled with vendors, carts, stray animals, and arguments that could start over something as simple as spilled wine. It was a city where fires were a constant fear, where thieves worked quietly in busy crowds, and where walking home after dark required a certain amount of courage. At the same time, it was also a city full of energy. Markets buzzed with activity. Workshops produced goods used across the empire. Taverns filled with laughter, shouting, and occasionally furniture being thrown across the room. Families raised children in tiny apartments, while merchants built businesses just downstairs. Life in these neighborhoods was chaotic, noisy, and unpredictable. But it was also human, because empires are not really built by emperors alone. They are built by ordinary people, bakers, carpenters, dock workers, shopkeepers, and countless others who keep a city alive day after day. The marble monuments might have represented Rome's power, but the crowded streets represented its reality. And if you truly wanted to understand what life in ancient Rome was like, you would not spend all your time admiring statues in the Forum. You would walk through the neighborhoods where people actually lived, preferably during daylight, and preferably while keeping one hand firmly on your wallet. Because while Rome ruled the world, its streets still operated by a very simple rule: stay alert, or someone else might help themselves to your belongings.